This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington. Good afternoon. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, is making his final return to Washington, 44 years after he left the White House. Mr. Carter died Sunday, December 29th, at the age of 100 years old. As his personal pastor told our Mark Strassman, the Sunday school teacher got called home on a Sunday. Well, later today, Carter will lie in state at the US Capitol, where there will be a memorial there. As you can see here, a US Air Force plane named Special Mission 39 in his honor, because he was the 39th president, flew his casket and the Carter family from Georgia to Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. If you're looking at this picture, you're saying, well, that looks like Air Force One. Well, it is the same plane that flies the President of the United States, but it's only called Air Force One when the President is on it. So now it is Special Air Mission 39 in honor of Jimmy Carter. This is actually the same plane that transported President George H.W. Bush in his final return to Washington. Now, this arrival ceremony is set to begin, and that's why we're live on the air to bring it to you, along with analysis and historic perspective. The former president had lain in repose since Saturday evening at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and we're told today that more than 23,000 people visited there to pay their respects to the former president. Then, after a departure ceremony at the center, his casket was taken by hearse to Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Marietta, Georgia, for the flight back here to the Washington, D.C. area to Andrews Air Force Base. I want to check in with senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. She is at Joint Base Andrews, where Carter's casket has just arrived. Good afternoon, Weijia, and describe the ceremony that we'll see this afternoon.
Nora, good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to everybody. Well, you see the jet that you are talking about right behind me. And as you mentioned, it is not Air Force One today. But when Carter, the former president, was president riding around on Air Force One, he was known to carry his own luggage on and off board. And I mentioned that, Nora, because I know today you'll be reflecting so much about that small detail and how it represents his giant legacy as a simple, everyday man who really rejected the pomp and circumstance that came along with the presidency. But there will be no shortage of that today during this arrival ceremony. We will soon see emerging from this plane 33 members of the immediate Carter family, including the former president's 3 sons, 1 daughter, 11 grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren. They are a very close-knit family that really have been planning this arrival ceremony, including every part of today's events for several months, we are told by an official here at Joint Base Andrews, even down to the music, Nora. And so for this ceremony, they have chosen a traditional hymn, Abide With Me, that we will be hearing from the band here. And we will also be seeing a special honor guard today. In just a moment, we'll see the formation that is made up of the Joint Chiefs, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Chief of Staff to the Army, the Commandant to the Marine Corps, and the Chief of Naval Operations, along with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of Space Operations. And this is the first time ever, Nora, that the Space Force will be participating in a state funeral. And so even though the former president was so eager to play down all of the ceremony that came with being the Commander-in-Chief, today, Nora, we will see so much of that, along with invited guests, invited active duty military members, and friends of the family, including that personal pastor that you spoke about. Nora?
Weijia Jiang reporting from Andrews Air Force Base, where it is a brisk and cold day here in our nation's capital, but the sun has come out for Jimmy Carter's return. We are joined today by an esteemed group of journalists, and I have to just point out it's a special day because Bob Schieffer is here. It's so good to see you, Bob. Of course, the longtime host of Face the Nation, and of course, you were White House correspondent during the Ford years and then got to cover Jimmy Carter. first, great to see you. And so
Thank
good to
you.
have you here. And just as sort of you reflect on this moment in history.
Well, I'm not 100 yet, but I'm getting close to it. I'm very honored to be here and to be a part of this. Jimmy Carter, people down through the years have said, well, what was he like? He was not like the others. Every president is different, but Jimmy Carter was very different. He was a sincere man. He was a religious man. He came because he wanted to do good things for the American people. And sometimes people say, yeah, well, that's what all politicians say. I think in Jimmy Carter's case, he actually meant it.
You know, Bob, you had conversations with 11 men that became president of the United States. Would you say that Jimmy Carter was the most unpretentious of them all?
Jimmy Carter was the most unpretentious, but Gerald Ford, who came before him and who was his opponent, was also very unpretentious. The difference was Gerald Ford was used to being around reporters, and he was very, very easy to deal with. Jimmy Carter had not had the kind of contact with reporters, even though he was a governor and a member of the state Senate. That's different than being the president. When you come to Washington, and here's this total establishment. A lot of people couldn't figure out what he had done to get here and all of that. So he had a little rough going in the beginning, but he did it, and he ran for president for all the right reasons. And I think in that case, he did well.
Today, we are witnessing America's final salute to Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, and it begins with this ceremony that we will witness shortly at Andrews Air Force Base. Want to again bring in Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa, and this will be a few days of the nation's capital honoring the former president.
It will be great to be with you, Nora, and great to have Bob Schieffer here, along with our friend Doug Brinkley. To build on what Bob Schieffer was saying, Jimmy Carter was one of the top political stories of the 20th century. This governor from Georgia who comes out of nowhere in 1976 to become the Democratic nominee and then ultimately president of the United States. And as Bob said, when he did come to Washington, many in the press corps, many in the Washington establishment said, Jimmy who? I mean, he was elected president, but they're still getting to know who he is. In fact, Nora, in the last week, I've been going through some old Carter files from different Carter aides, and I found a few memos, Bob, about Jimmy Carter's White House thinking about the press strategy, and they said they needed to reach up more to CBS, have people from CBS over to the White House for dinner. And we'll say to any president, we'll welcome those invitations anytime. But Jimmy Carter, as you see there, he was someone who was tough. He was defiant. Yes, he's defiant, as Doug Brinkley and others have written in so many beautiful ways about his post-presidency and his service to the world. But let us not forget, as he returns to Washington today, that he is a great Washington story, someone who came from nowhere to become president of the United States. And whether you're a Republican or Democrat, if you go down to Plains, Georgia, and Archery, Georgia, and you go to that boyhood home, and you think to yourself, in 1924, this young kid was growing up here, and he ultimately became president of the United States. It inspires you as an American. And he didn't maybe conquer Washington, but he took Washington by storm, an outsider in a city of insiders, and he got a lot done. And that Andrews Air Force Base we're looking at right now, such a place for President Carter as he engaged in foreign affairs. He labored to get peace throughout the world. You think about his inaugural in 1977, talking about peace and human rights. He brought all these issues to the forefront at a time when they were not at the top of conversation in the United States or in the world.
We're also joined by presidential historian Douglas Brinkley. So good to have you. And he is the author of The Unfinished Presidency, Jimmy Carter's Legacy Beyond the White House. You also spent so much time with the Carter family. Remark on how the family's doing today.
Well, you know, Jason Carter, the grandson, has sort of taken over the reins of trying to kind of choreograph everything. He's done a great job these past years since President Carter went into hospice, kind of alerting the press, alerting well-wishers about the now deceased president, his grandfather's health. But all three of his boys, Chip Carter gave a very moving eulogy for his father. I thought he would kind of break down crying, and he almost did there at the end. So there, and then of course, you know, the Carter family is really Georgia. There are all sorts of cousins and grandkids, and so you know, here there are two Jimmy Carters in Georgia: the Atlanta Jimmy Carter and the Plains Carter. In fact, getting an interview used to be better at Plains because he'd be relaxed and in the living room, and he's in the hospitality. Or in Atlanta at the Carter Center, you would get more of a you know, the proficient engineer kind of, don't waste my time. One thing I'd like to reflect on what Bob said, for all of Carter really didn't like to waste time. Talk about an engineering president, only Herbert Hoover. If you were a second late, you didn't get your interview. You didn't get to talk to him. And yet, and we used to say in the book business, he lived off of 30-some books. He was the fastest autographer. He would turn nobody down line, but be like this. And at Maranatha Baptist Church, you're welcome. Visitors could come, and you go sit there and listen to the president, and afterward you do a quick selfie with them. But so he was resourceful in a kind of the gospel of efficiency he learned being on a nuclear submarine, where there's nothing to waste and every second matters.
We're going to talk so much about his presidency and his incredible post-presidency as well throughout this afternoon as we witness this procession. I just want to point out what we are seeing right now. The family has disembarked from the aircraft. They have moved into position here to observe this arrival ceremony. This is the military body bearer team, and they will remove the casket from what is this aircraft loader here. And then we will see the ceremonial troops present arms and render honors. There will be 4 ruffles and flourishes, hail to the chief, and a 21-gun salute. In preparing today for the research, we're going to hear hail to the chief many times today, but apparently while President Jimmy Carter did not like to hear.
He tried to stop it.
Yeah.
In fact, he thought it was too much, and he stopped it for a while. I think they later started doing it again, but that was one of the things. But to go back again, he was such an unpretentious man. I think the two most unpretentious men were Gerald Ford, who came before him, and President Carter. He just didn't like all the pomp and circumstance about it. It wasn't him, and he was kind of uncomfortable with it.
But there was sometimes a cost to that lack of pretentiousness. He famously sold the Sequoia, the presidential yacht that Richard Nixon used to love, bringing people out to have a stake at the lawmakers from Congress would come on the presidential boat. President Carter gets rid of the Sequoia. Yeah. And a lot of the lawmakers on Capitol Hill said, hey, we like that boat. Yeah. It'd be nice to have the trappings of the presidency once in a while, but that wasn't Carter's style. Just real quickly, Doug Brinkley mentioned the signatures. After his presidency, Carter stopped signing his name Jimmy Carter and just signed it J. Carter. Quicker to sign the book. Jay Carter.
Yeah. I wonder how much time that saved.
We're joined by Jay Dickerson, otherwise known as John Dickerson as well, our senior political analyst who joins us from New York. And John, you have studied and written about so many presidents, including Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, going back to that. Well, on the topic of speed and speed reading, Jimmy Carter actually held classes on speed reading in the cabinet room when he was president to not only increase his speed in reading. It was estimated that he read 300 to 400 pages of briefing. Of course, with every White House, they always up the number of pages that the president is reading, perhaps not with the incoming one. But that is a boasting point. But he took speed reading classes, and at one point, to get the vote of a California senator, he read the senator's book on semantics, which is a bit of a rarity for President Carter because he wasn't too much into the kind of stroking you have to do of Washington politicians, which has been mentioned, his outsider status and that disinterest in the trappings of the office of the presidency, which manifested itself in so many different ways, He got out of the motorcade and walked during his inauguration. He carried his own baggage. He wanted to be his own chief of staff. All of this was a reaction to the imperial presidency of Nixon and LBJ, the idea that he would be more approachable and more reasonable as a human in the office, not some imperious president. But in his personal behavior and his sense and confidence of himself, he was pretty imperious. He was pretty confident that he had the right way. So outwardly quite humble, lived a Christian life that is a model of humility, but very, very self-confident. And that's what clashed with those Washington politicians who thought, who's this new guy telling us what to do? And he thought they should be listening a little more closely to him because he'd done all that speed reading.
John, just as you're speaking to, we're playing the old footage of Jimmy Carter as president carrying his own bags. Why did he do that, Douglas?
Because of time and efficiency.
Really?
It's quicker. You don't have to wait at the luggage bin. And so he would grab it and move.
But there's no waiting at a luggage bin when you're president of the United States.
Well, he started it when he was campaigning. He had very little money, and he wanted to show donors in 1976 he's not wasting your money. He would sleep on people's cots in rooms. He didn't get them even the days in motel room. Often he would look for the free lodging and just crash. His success as ex-president was because he was frugal with money. If you gave him a donation for guinea worm disease or river blindness for $2 million, he would not waste a nickel. He was a kind of an accounting person. His lawyer, Terry Adamson, could testify to that, how just every nickel and dime mattered, to the point I went to the library in Americus once to look through local history files, and there I saw a letter from Jimmy Carter with the dime on it, and he had borrowed a dime to Xerox something and then wrote a letter to whoever gave him the dime at the library, because he was not going to take a dime from somebody. But with what we're looking at right now, remember, President Carter did greenlight what we're dealing with here with his memorial services, except he did not want any train, his casket on a train, because of the slowness of it, that the airplane would get his body back faster and more efficiently. And everything about Carter's about engineering and efficiency, and why we're looking anew at his interest in solar and ways to save energy. Remember, the thermostats reduced in the White House and elsewhere. And talk about humble. He's back in his plane, his home, his house in Plains, bought in 1961. He's lived there his whole life. Today, it's worth I saw $2,010 on Zillow. That he lived modestly. He had has a home up in the Georgia mountains to do fly fishing, which was a religion for Jimmy Carter. His love of fly fishing has probably been underplayed this past week. That's the joy he shared with Rosalind Carter and himself and friends, that you could go out and get away to some of the wild places of the world.
One of the things that people in Plains liked about Jimmy Carter was after he became president, and then you reminded me of this, the real estate prices went up. Everybody's house went up, and a number of people sold their houses because, they'd never been able to get those kind of prices for them. So Carter kind of enjoyed that. He didn't go out and make speeches about it, but he kind of enjoyed
and there, as you all remember, there's that old ceramic roadside peanut that's there when you enter Plains. He was trying to get rid of that forever because it kind of was an eyesore. I loved it. There he made Welcome to Plains. But then his gas station, where Billy Carter famously used to talk to the press and spin them and introduce reporters to Heineken and foreign beers sometimes.
Until he got his own brand.
Until he got his own. I was just saying, then he got Billy brand beer, and Carter had an amazing ability to deal with people that are a little bit eccentric. He was like this, a slide ruler. But when you're dealing with Billy Carter, his brother, who was a real character, and his sister Ruth Stapleton, who was a faith-healing evangelist, and Gloria, his sister, was a motorcycle rider, and on her tomb is she lived in Harley
First
Heaven.
100,000-mile rider in the Harley Davidson Hall of Fame.
So one of the reasons he won in 76 is he wasn't afraid to deal with people a little off the grid, even though he was this born-again Christian and doing the miracle of winning southern states after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Acts in 64 and 65.
We're looking at now America's airfield, which is Joint Base Andrews, where the President of the United States and other members of the government fly out from just outside Washington, D.C. here. And what you see is the entire ceremony set to begin to honor the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. This is Special Air Mission 39 is designated. This is otherwise known as Air Force One when the president flies on it, and it departed Dobbins Air Reserve Base north of Atlanta just this morning. And then this motorcade will wind through our nation's capital, through and past the U.S. Navy War Memorial, and then to the U.S. Capitol, where we will watch a ceremony and eulogies tonight later this afternoon by members of the Senate and the House. And then the former president's body will lie in repose, and people can go and visit. So if you're in or near Washington, or if you want to get in the car or make your way, you have tonight and tomorrow to pay your respects if you haven't already done so in Atlanta. I just want to note, too, and there you have that incredible view of the US Capitol and the Rotunda. It still takes my breath away, even every time I walk in there, but also just to see this picture of our beautiful United States Capitol and what we will witness later today, and people can go by and pay their respects. We can almost hear some of the echoes there from inside. I want to check in with our senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe, who is in a key position. Ed?
Good, thanks. We're still on TikTok.
Nora, good to be with you, and like the others, especially great to see Bob this afternoon. I've already heard from a few viewers quite excited to see him join us today. So wonderful to have him back. We are here at the Navy Memorial, as you mentioned, along Pennsylvania Avenue. This is a memorial to the Navy that was established and approved by then President Carter back in 1980, and pays tribute to all of those who have served or will serve the nation on the high seas and in the skies. The procession, as it makes its way through Washington, will stop here. This is a special Carter-only tribute to him that was added at his request and his family's request to mark the fact that he is a Navy veteran. He served from 1946 to 1953, and he's only one of 3 U.S. presidents to ever graduated from a military academy, the only one from the Naval Academy. The other 2, of course, Ulysses Grant and Dwight Eisenhower up at West Point. The funeral procession will come here to the Navy Memorial, and there will be a ceremony led by senior members of the military, and then his casket will be transferred from a hearse into the horse-drawn military carriage, or a caisson, that will then take him up to the U.S. Capitol. He will be followed by the riderless horse with the boots in reverse, the kind of tribute the military gives to commanders-in-chief and other senior military officers. This is another point that television viewers especially might recognize or might remember, because it's at this spot normally, or around here, that a president gets out of the limousine and walks for a few blocks to wave to the crowds on his inauguration day. Well, the first president to do that was Jimmy Carter back in 1977, stunning the crowd for walking from this point all the way up to the White House, again, trying to eschew the trappings of the presidency and humanize it more. He decided to walk the rest of the route. So we will wait to see this in a few minutes. Now back to Joint Base Andrews.
Thank you, Ed. And we have just witnessed the 4 ruffles and flourishes. Hail to the chief, the 21-gun salute. And following these honors, you can see, we just heard the U.S. Air Force Band playing Abide With Me. And the military body bearer team has placed the casket inside the hearse, and it will shortly depart to the U.S. Navy Memorial and then to the U.S. Capitol for that service later this afternoon. We are pleased to be joined by James Fallow, presidential speechwriter for Carter for several years. And so good to see you, Jim, and have you here. You not only worked with Jimmy Carter for several years, you then, of course, wrote about his presidency. And I know in one of those things you called Jimmy Carter an unlucky president, but a lucky man. How so?
So I think when he was president, all these many decades ago, so many things broke against him. The world was in terrible shape. The U.S. was in terrible shape. Almost any malady you can think of these days, we had a more tense version of then. But in the 44 years nearly he had as former president, he lived long enough to not only reinvent the role of former president, but to have the constancy of his character, which I think had always been the same, show through in his writing, in his work around the world, in his peacemaking, in his faith. All the things that he had been, for better and worse as president, he was able to show to their best advantage in these many years.
He was such an outsider, though, and I think just to remind people, and this is from your own writing, too, I mean, Democrats had enormous majorities at the time. I mean, the majority leader was Robert Byrd. Democrats had 61 seats in the Senate. Under Tip O'Neill, the margin was 150 seats. I mean, to think about Democrats controlled Washington, and yet Jimmy Carter's relationship with Tip O'Neill was tense, or you describe it.
They could not have been more different people. As you say, the only politics in those days were politics within the Democratic bloc because the majorities were huge. And Democrats in those days assumed they would always naturally control the House. And so Carter, again, was a very different person from Tip O'Neill. He was not a machine politician. He had no national political experience. And so the same freshness and outsiderness that we remember from those days that made him so popular. I think he still has the highest popularity rating of any first-term president, in the time since then. Also meant he didn't really know all the ropes of dealing with Congress. And so that accounted both for his freshness and some of his difficulties, I think.
Jill, I think, if I could just add to that point, I think he ran a terrific campaign when you come right down to it. Saying, I will not lie to you after Watergate and what the country had gone through had been great. But he advertised himself to be someone who was an outsider, who was not part of the Washington establishment. And that was had a great deal to do with him being elected. Once he got to Washington, he turned out to be just what he had advertised himself to be, someone who was an outsider, who was not part of the establishment, and it really took him a while to get adjusted.
Hey, Jim, just real quick, what was President Carter like up close in the Oval Office? You were a speechwriter for President Carter. You worked with him closely. You saw Hamilton, Jordan, and Jody Powell and this tight-knit group around him, but you had entry into that inner circle as a speechwriter working on some major addresses. What was he like up close at the height of his power?
You all were talking recently about his autographing approach. I have lots of his autograph material. It usually says things like, do better, very poor, not funny enough. He was quite a demanding taskmaster. And so I think that people who worked for him respected him and had enormous admiration for his constancy and his fidelity and all the rest. But he was not an easy person to work for. I think one of the aphorisms was easier to admire than to work for, which may be the case with many strong leaders.
I think the word that has been used over and over again was his discipline, incredible discipline.
Discipline, and what Bob said, he really was honest. He lived up to his campaign, but he arrived in January of 1977 saying, the Democratic Party is an albatross around my neck. He wanted nothing really to do with Senator Ted Kennedy or with Scoop Jackson, and he jammed the Panama Canal Treaty right out of the gate, dividing Democrats. I interviewed Senator Talmadge down at his pond house down in Georgia, and Talmadge said, "Look, I love Carter. I'm the senator from Georgia, and I've known him forever. But what he did to Panama Canal to the Democratic Party is unforgivable.
And notable that Donald Trump today was talking about just that, someone who demands unity and loyalty.
I was in Panama very recently. Can I say, I actually view this as one of Carter's great achievements, that he was able, both diplomatically, these were negotiations that started under Richard Nixon, as you know, because of the security threat to Panama. And he got 68 votes in the Senate to do this, which was one of his great legislative achievements, I think. But yes, it had the effect you talked about.
John Dick. A lot of the people who voted for it in the Senate got beat in the next election.
Jennings Randolph and others, yes.
Yeah.
John Dickerson is with us as well. John?
Hey, Jim. We've been talking about the team that existed in Washington, which is to say the Democrats. I want to ask you about the team he picked, which is to say his cabinet. Outsiders come into Washington, they're going to shake things up. He had this different view of existing Democrats, but he also had a different view about the way cabinets are arranged, and he was going to try and do it differently. Can you just tell that story briefly and how that contributed to his difficulty? This person who is quite interested in the details was trying to rewrite the way a cabinet works. Tell that story.
So John, you have told this story, and I will let you give the full version. But what struck me is two things about the cabinet. One is these were eminent people. You know, Cyrus Vance, who he chose over George Bull as Secretary of State, and he had the first Energy Secretary James Schlesinger and Ray Marshall as Labor Secretary, and a number of other eminent people. But Carter felt as if they should be, he should not be really taking counsel from them. The other, of course, as you know, John, really significant cabinet story was after Carter gave his famed 1979 crisis of confidence speech, it was wildly popular for about a week until he asked the entire cabinet for its resignation, and that was when sort of the long slide accelerated.
He worked hard to put a lot of women and African Americans into government. And there's a great story I just read about Jonathan Alter in his biography of President Carter was talking about how many federal judges that were women and African Americans that Carter had appointed.
To just build on Doug's point about President Carter's promotion of women and people of color, so much of that aspect of the Carter story comes back to his mother, Miss Lillian, a nurse down in Georgia who ministered to not only whites in Georgia, but to black Americans. And that example influenced Carter from an early age, and it influenced how he thought about race. So when you think about Carter in January 1971, telling Georgians the time for racial discrimination is over, stunning Georgia, but it didn't stun people who really knew Jimmy Carter, because his mother, along with his wife Rosalind, there was a side of compassion there on race for those who were struggling. And Carter's post-presidency, I would argue, deeply influenced by his own mother's example. Miss Lillian, as she was known, served in the Peace Corps.
At age 68.
68. At age 68, going to India and elsewhere. It was this commitment to service, this commitment to diversity that coursed through the veins of Jimmy Carter, influenced by his mother, and it was forged again and again throughout his life.
And do you think that played a role, Douglas, too, in this amazing love affair and marriage that he had with his wife?
There's no question, and really you can't talk about Jimmy Carter without Rosalind Carter. They are inseparable. Her big interest in life developed in helping people that were mentally challenged, and she did great work at Georgia Southwestern. But she also just was with them every step of the way, every campaign, handing out leaflets. When he would go to Iowa, she would go. And with John and Betty Pope, that was his only true deep friend, Jimmy Carter. There's a loner side to President Carter. It was John Pope, and John and Betty Pope would do anything for him, and they went up with the Peanut Brigade in New Hampshire, but they traveled all over the world together. You know, talking about over 130 countries. People don't even know the countries that Jimmy and Rosalind Carter have gone to, and then to work together as a team, house building, hammers in the heat. I brought a group of students from different universities to build a house for Habitat Humanity with President Carter and Mrs. Carter and the Popes. We all all, as a class, put up a home, and she was out there in the sun hammering away, and they were challenging each other. Who would stay longer? And he didn't want to eat anything fancy. He'd just eat a ham sandwich, and you know, but we got to get back to work again, not wanting to waste a minute. But he said the problem, President Carter told me, with volunteerism is that people get excited if you're to work with the former president, but after day 2 and 3, people start not wanting to work. And the challenge in America is how do you get volunteers to the stick-to-itness? Not everybody's like Jimmy and Rosalind Carter.
And you know, he really worked when he went to do these things, to build things for Habitat for Humanity and all that. He knew how to hammer and saw. I mean, I was an apprentice carpenter during my high school, and that's what I do, working in the summer. And you could tell it wasn't the first time he'd ever picked up a skill saw, or the first time he knew what he was doing, and he actually worked. It wasn't just a photo opportunity. And of all things, that's one of the things I really admired about
It's a huge point, because also growing up in archery on the farm there, they would slaughter hogs and chickens. And he knew how to, was a great carpenter. He made the collection bowls in his church. The chair you're sitting on, he made. Like you as a painter, he started painting in life and writing poems and writing a novel about the Revolutionary War. But we were talking about Hail to the Chief and his reluctancy to the imperial presidency. But when he was at the Naval Academy in 1943, they hazed him. They wanted him to sing Marching Through Georgia, a 1965 song. All the plebes said, or the midshipmen were trying to make him sing it, and he refused, and they would beat him and hit him to sing the song, sing about how the Yankees beat the Confederates, and he wouldn't sing it. And that's how we might forget how much he loved the South sometimes, and how much he loved Georgia.
Yeah.
He carried the South and loved it. He loved the music of the South. In the White House, he kept a stereo playing music all the time, often classical music, but often people from Phil Walden's Capricorn Records, the Allman Brothers, and Willie Nelson was like, he loved, Willie is out there watching somewhere now. They were really tight, Willie Nelson. Back to the eccentricity, they just were like brothers. And Bob Dylan, who he's the one who took Bob Dylan aside and talked to him about Christianity, and led Dylan into doing albums like Slow Train and Saved and Shot of Love. And we forget when Carter got sworn in, there was a new Christian movement going on, and also the New South, which Atlanta was the end all at that time.
I mean, how influential was that? That Hunter S. Thompson and Rolling Stone said, "I think he's cool."
Oh, I think it was enormous. And when I mentioned, the lucky and unlucky factor, it was luck that Hunter S. Thompson had this rhapsodic piece in Rolling Stone about his Law Day speech about 2 years before he became president, and sort of made him, as part of his becoming cool. So it was really important, I think, for Jimmy Carter when he ran for president and during his first year or two, that he seemed to bridge all the different divides in American society, black and white, young and old, Vietnam pro and con. He was a person who had that kind of magical connection.
And just to build on which,
I want to ask you one thing, because I agree with everything you said. Why did he give the interview to Playboy magazine?
He was, it was early in the campaign. He was not knowing how far he was going to go. He was looking for press. And so I remember being on the campaign plane when that came out. I have lusted my heart for other women. Think how that compares on the historical gradient now. But yes, that's why he did it. It was, a campaign.
And Jody Powell and Ham Jordan were looking at polling, and he wasn't polling well with men. And the thought was that being a born-again Christian, he may be too square. Now, Rolling Stone crowd helped him a little, but they thought Playboy interview, and Bob Shearer, who's still around, who did that interview, teaches at University of Southern Cal, they thought this would make him seem like, get the guy vote up a little, and it blew up on him, almost cost him.
I got to tell you, after that, I was covering, there was a Republican thing going on, and there was some old guy, and I for the life of me, I can't remember his name, but he had been a big segregationist and so forth. But he got up to talk about it, and he said, "They say let it all hang out. They say let it all." I don't believe I'd have said that.
It's in the "I will never tell you a lie, I'll never lie to you" tradition of Carter.
That Hunter S. Thompson story is an important one to remember, because in 1972, Hunter S. Thompson this famous writer, sometimes incendiary prose, writes Fear and Loathing on the campaign trail. And Carter is at the convention in Miami Beach, and he's looking at the whole Democratic Party with his aides, and he says, we can beat these guys if we ever decide to run. And Ham Jordan famously writes a memo saying, here's how you can make it to the White House in 1976. But when you go back and read that Hunter S. Thompson story, what impressed Thompson more than anything about Jimmy Carter is that he was willing to take on Teddy Kennedy. Yes. Hunter Thompson said nobody in Washington pushes Teddy Kennedy around, but this no-name Georgia governor has the guts to do it without being coarse or without going over the line. And Hunter S. Thompson said for years, Jimmy Carter's perhaps the toughest politician. He also said the meanest, not in a cruelty way, but one of the toughest, meanest politicians he ever covered, because Carter didn't suffer anybody who he thought was either beneath him politically or he could barrel through. And that really made a mark with Thompson for the rest of Thompson's life, that this guy was someone to watch, even as the rest of the Washington press corps said, Jimmy who?
And Hunter then lived on the Carter's property for a few days, became very close to Billy, and set up the big interview to go to the Atlanta stock car races. And Hunter was there, was fumbling with the drink in his tape recorder. And they went, and they 5 hours of tape, President Carter told me, and Hunter screwed up the tapes. He didn't have them. And then Carter told me the next bad luck, the big star reporter was Theodore White, who wrote a series of these books. White came with these old reel-to-reel kind of things and went into planes to interview him hours, and suddenly they looked after the whole interview, and all the film was on the floor. And he retreated White back to America, and Carter said, I'll give you another one tomorrow, and White left. But after Carter left the presidency, he was trying to think about his post-presidency, Theodore White told him, write your memoir like you did Why Not the Best, the campaign book that Broadman Press published and Carter used as a handout to get people to know who he was.
And it was actually good.
It was good, the early part, really.
Just to update everyone on what we are seeing, we are watching the motorcade with the former president as they make their way to the US Capitol. They will do a quick stop, too, at the US Navy Memorial, and we will cover that because that will be a ceremony, as Jimmy Carter is the only graduate of the Naval Academy to then make it to the presidency. So it's going to be quite a ceremony there with some midshipmen from the US Naval Academy there to honor the former president as well before the ceremony up at the US Capitol. There's much to discuss as we honor the former president on this day. And then, of course, there is that state funeral again on Thursday where we will hear President Joe Biden eulogize, I should say, Jimmy Carter as well as others at the National Cathedral. I got the opportunity to interview President Carter in 2018. And one of the things I did want to ask him about at the time was what he wanted his legacy to be. How do you want to be remembered?
Well, but my family, I hope I could be remembered as a good great-grandfather and a good grandfather and a good father. By my wife, I hope I could be remembered as a good husband. But in politics, as a champion of peace and human rights, I was lucky enough to keep our country at peace for the 4 years that I served. And we were, I think, looked upon as a champion of human rights then. So that's the two things I guess politically speaking of it, I'm proud of.
John Dickerson, and notable to hear him mention things that did not necessarily include his time as president.
That's right. I mean, he saw his life in this sort of much larger terms and keeping faith with his faith. And so, he had this larger view. I was thinking, as you all were talking about Habitat for Humanity, where Jimmy Carter spent so many years physically there, hammering nails and cutting. In an interview, he talked about that experience and why he did it. And he said one of the reasons was it's very difficult for somebody who's well off to cross a barrier and get in touch with a very poor family who's in need and never has had a decent home. But Habitat provides that avenue very automatically. He was explaining how this experience was giving something to him by keeping him in touch with people who didn't have all of the advantages that he did. This is a former president. Think of the many former presidents in recent history who've gone to give multi-$100,000 speeches to well-heeled people in fancy ballrooms, who have traded essentially on their office. And he went back to that small house that he renovated with his wife often, Rosalind, and lived this life that was staying consistent with that set of values that he kept with him, that were born in planes, but then also through a great American institution, the Naval Academy. I mean, when you think of his story as an American story, anybody can grow up to be president. He kind of fits that bill through not only being born in America, but also through the great institution of the Naval Academy. Then his father gets sick. He goes back home. I mean, this is a life that carried with it a set of values that last and continue well over the brief period he was president.
It's an excellent point, John Dickerson. And Bob, didn't you have a conversation with Jimmy Carter where you asked him about, in fact, being remembered for much more than what he did during his presidency?
I did. I told him at one point, I said, you may be the only president, the only person who's been president that I know who didn't think the presidency was the high point of your life.
Yeah.
And he laughed. He got a big kick out of it, but he didn't rebut that. Mm-hmm. He said, but what he did tell me, and what made that conversation so memorable to me, he said, but I'll tell you this, he said, do you know, I saw my favorite cartoon the other day in the New Yorker. He said it was a little boy talking to his father, and he said, when I grow up, I want to be a former president. And I said, I think you liked that one. He said, I did.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, when Carter gave interviews over the years where he appreciated the recognition for his post-presidency, but there was a part of him that didn't love it in its entirety because he wanted his presidency to be appreciated. And there was this piston inside of President Carter that his presidency was misunderstood, that he could have attacked Iran. He's told confidants over the years, I could have destroyed Iran after they took our hostages, but I kept the peace. And if that rescue mission had been successful with the hostages, he always thought just if they had sent a few more helicopters, that maybe it would have succeeded and he would have won re-election in 1980. And so he appreciated the accolades. He liked that New Yorker cartoon. But at the same time, this is someone who was proud of his presidency and felt he was dealing with the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets in 1979, the Iranian hostage crisis, inflation at home. And he was trying his best to manage it all. And he wasn't just someone who was a Southerner outsider fumbling with the job.
And the Camp David Accords, we should talk about his accomplishments as president and whether they have been underestimated. But I do want to point out you are looking at pictures of the U.S. Navy Memorial and a number of people lining the cold streets of Pennsylvania Avenue to get a glimpse of this motorcade. We're already a formation of midshipmen from the U.S. Naval Academy are there. The U.S. Navy Band, the Secretary of the Navy is there, the Superintendent of the Naval Academy, Vice Admiral Yvette M. Davids, the first female head of the U.S. Naval Academy, is there as well. So we'll go there shortly. And then after the Naval Academy, former president and the motorcade head to the U.S. Capitol for a ceremony there. And I want to bring in congressional correspondent Nicole Killian. She is on Capitol Hill. And Nicole, thank you for braving the cold today. And tell us what we will see at the Capitol later.
Yeah, well, it's a lot colder here than it is in Plains, Georgia right now, Nora, but I'm sure President Carter wouldn't mind, of course, this tribute that will be paid in his honor here at the U.S. Capitol later this afternoon. You know, here on Capitol Hill, so often we lament the gridlock and the lack of bipartisanship at times, but on this day, Republicans and Democrats are united in their respect of the 39th president, and that will be on display when his remains are brought here to the east front of the Capitol on a horse-drawn carriage. His casket will be carried right up these main steps directly into the Capitol Rotunda, where a ceremony will be held in his honor. That will be led by the new Senate Majority Leader John Thune, as well as House Speaker Mike Johnson and Vice President Kamala Harris, all of whom will deliver eulogies and lay wreaths in his memory. Of course, Carter's family will be here in attendance, along with members of Congress and other dignitaries and members of the Supreme Court, the mayor of Washington, D.C., members of the cabinet and diplomatic corps. And after this ceremony concludes, of course, the president will lie in state here at the U.S. Capitol for the next 2 days, where members of the public can also pay their respects as well.
Nicole Killian, thank you for that update of what we will see shortly. Let's go back to senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe at the Navy Memorial, where Carter's casket will arrive in just moments. Ed, what are you seeing there?
Reagan chose it. George H.W. Bush did not.
Nora, they're less than a mile from this spot, and this spot along the route is mostly meant to symbolize the fact that the 39th president was, for a time, a Navy submariner. As we said earlier, he served from 1946 to 1953, one of 3 presidents to graduate from a military academy, in this case, of course, the Navy Academy. His remains will stop here at the Navy Memorial, and an event that will unfold here in front of what's called the Lone Sailor statue, which represents all who have or will one day serve the Navy. It contains artifacts from 8 Navy ships, including the USS Seawolf, which was the submarine that Lieutenant Carter was training on to serve before he left the service to return and run the family peanut farm in Plains, Georgia. And it's at this spot, as we said earlier, in 1977, where he got out of his limousine and made the walk to the White House for his inauguration. They have asked us to be silent once this ceremony begins here. We'll point out that the other element of this you'll see is that his casket will be placed on a horse-drawn military caisson and be followed by a riderless horse. We've seen this image so many times before at state funerals for presidents and for other senior military leaders. We've been told by our friends in the military that the horse that will serve is named Remington, and he is the fastest and best behaved horse in the collection that performs these ceremonies, so they picked the best one for today. We should also note, Nora, that the streets of Pennsylvania, right here along Pennsylvania Avenue, arguably the best paved location in Washington today with all the snow on the ground. They did several runs here to make sure that everything was safe and clean for the Carter family, which will follow the casket up to the Capitol for the beginnings of those ceremonies Nicole was laying out moments ago. But this is arguably the most solemn part of the ceremonies in Washington so far, one we've seen only a few times before for Presidents Reagan and Ford, most recently President Bush as well, and one today that is sadly sparsely attended, both because of the weather and because of the incredible security precautions that have been taken across the city given the recent events in New Orleans and Las Vegas and the preparations for the presidential inauguration. Nora.
Ed O'Keefe there at the U.S. Navy Memorial. And the caisson detachment is part of the U.S. Army's 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment. You heard Ed mention the lead horse, Remington, and not to leave out the full 8 horses that will be there, as well as 5 soldiers. The other horses are Bullet, Rocket, Burns, Scout, Poncho, Regal, and Gunther, which we will see, of course, this beautiful tradition. And there you can see, look how gorgeous that caisson and the midshipmen from the U.S. Navy Memorial that are flanking that there as they will pay tribute. And I think we should talk about now his service in the U.S. Navy. What was it, seven years, am I right, from my memory, that he served in the U.S. Navy after graduating from the Naval Academy?
I think it's important to remember that in 1943, Naval Academy, we're in the middle of World War II, but they're training Jimmy Carter for the post-war Navy, which is nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project wasn't known about. There was no Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but over a period of time, he became part of the Admiral Rickover class. And they were ostracized by a lot of people at the Naval Academy and in the big Navy because it was a small SWAT group that was going to go on submarines, potentially with nuclear weapons. And Carter got into that program. And it takes a special kind of person to go from A to B with no radar detection, going low on the ocean floors, going all over along the shores of China and Asia. And he was both in the Atlantic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet. But he got out of he had one ambition in life, to be Chief of Naval Operations. And that left him when his father died, because he went back in 1953 and took over the family business, and also saw how many people his father helped by giving loans and things during the Great Depression and the like. But the Naval Academy now is really celebrating Jimmy Carter, and the Navy is. But for a while, in the Reagan era, he wasn't given the love out of the U.S. Navy that we're seeing today.
And Rickover did not want him to leave. In fact, he tried to block him from leaving. But his dad had died, and somebody had to go back and and take over.
Rosalind didn't want to go back to planes either.
Yeah. I want to bring in John Dickerson on this conversation because, John, that was such a formative moment for Jimmy Carter, too. I mean, he talked about the courage, self-sacrifice, and discipline that he learned during not only the academy, but his service after.
Exactly. Well, and think about going into a nuclear submarine. You know, it takes personal courage to go seal yourself up in a submarine and go deep under the water in something that is, as was mentioned, this is at the beginning of the nuclear fleet. And in 1953, Carter is a part of a team. There's a reactor malfunction on the Seawolf, I believe it is. And Carter is a part of the team that rushes in, exposes himself to radioactivity, which I think he was, at least at some level, mildly poisoned by, to solve the problem and save the submarine. So that was a moment not only of discipline and all that is a part of service, but also of personal courage. And Admiral Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, for whom Carter worked, the important role he also played is, Doug mentioned earlier, that campaign book that Carter passed out in 1976, Why Not the Best? That's a quote from Rickover, who chided Carter once when asking Carter how he'd done on something, and Carter said, you know, I think something along the lines of, I did pretty well, and Rickover said, why not the best, which Carter then took on as his mantra and offered as his campaign, which was a call not only to himself, but also to the country to strive, why not be the best? And to me, that's interesting because his sense of duty and his sense of the country's duty to itself almost connects later to that crisis of confidence speech he gives when he's in the White House, when he's trying to rally the nation, using those same kinds of arguments about why not all of us gather together and be the best in the face of this challenge, which at that time was the OPEC oil embargo and the energy crisis. And so Rickover has this through line in his life, in both his personal behavior, but also in the way he sort of conceived of America and its sense of itself.
We are looking at now the U.S. Navy War Memorial, and you can see the case in there, which the casket will be placed on for that final trip up Pennsylvania Avenue to the U.S. Capitol, and has been described, of course, this bookend of the former president's career. And we are told that some members of the family may join him for this one last walk along Pennsylvania Avenue as they head from the Navy Memorial to the Visitor Center at the United States Capitol.
As we watch this scene unfold on Pennsylvania Avenue, you can't help but think back to Pennsylvania Avenue on Inauguration Day, 1977, when he famously walked down Pennsylvania Avenue with the spirit of an everyman, of an American who didn't need the motorcade to get to and from where he was going. And it's just a powerful picture, hand in hand with Rosalind and his daughter, Amy Carter, waving to the thousands of people gathered around Pennsylvania Avenue. As one of his former advisors, the late Pat Goodell, once told me, never forget, Jimmy Carter was a naval officer, and he took pride in the country and the military, even though he strove for peace throughout his life, including during his presidency. And they always thought back to this spirit of 77 that walked down Pennsylvania Avenue. In fact, Jerry Rafshoon, who's still with us, 90 years old, still going strong, he told me the other day that in 1978 he wrote a memo to Carter saying that spirit of that walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, where Carter was, his smile, that famous grin was just so wide, the promise of the presidency laid before him. They tried to get back to that in 1978, 1979, 1980. It wasn't always easy, but you see there in Jimmy Carter, this outsider who's happy to be there, someone from a different part of the country, not part of the establishment, even though he went to Annapolis. And there he is, the President of the United States, on his first day, 1977.
And we see Amy Carter there,
yeah.
And she had to grow up in real time in the White House. And they were very protective of her. And she's a marvelous, independent-minded person, very progressive, an artist, a writer. She went to Memphis to study art, lived in New Orleans, Atlanta, and then got very involved with anti-nuclear causes. She would protest with Abby Hoffman up in Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts Amherst. She would go sit in on nuclear and anti-apartheid protest of the 80s and 90s.
And how did her parents, what did her parents think about that?
They loved it. Let Amy be Amy. I mean, she was like Ms. Lillian. She was a free spirit. And
went to a public school also while he was president. Good point,
Bob. And went to public school. And she's just one of the most, has one of the deepest hearts and loving people you would ever meet, Amy. And you know, I know she's mourning today in the last weeks, but she's very active now with the Carter Center. We've mentioned Jason Carter, the grandson, but Amy Carter is getting very involved with that too.
I mean, talk about just for a minute what the Carter Center has done. An incredible reach, not only in America, but around the world.
When in 1981, when they went back, he got the hostages. Ronald Reagan let him go to Germany and get there are 52 hostages.
Just after Reagan is inaugurated.
Not just after. And then they were depressed, but then Anwar Sadat was assassinated, and they were mopey until that moment. Jimmy Carter loved Anwar Sadat of Egypt, not just for Camp David, but they became friends. He called him Brother Anwar. He had a picture of Sadat on his desk. And he realized Sadat gave his life for Camp David that I brokered. I can give my life for peace. And the Carter Center, built where Sherman witnessed the burning of Atlanta. And I just told you Carter wouldn't sing the song at the Naval Academy about burning of Atlanta, and that it took off and does election monitoring, combating everything from guinea worm, river blindness, on and on. But he then they called it parachuting for peace. Carter would go in and visit people around the world, unsavory leaders. I went with President Carter to Haiti once and watched him how he interacted with how Haiti can build a government. And I went with him to see Yasser Arafat in Gaza City at one point. And I think later today we might hear from Terry Adamson, who knows all of this period because he was the lawyer for President Carter dealing with these Carter years.
Look at this now. This is President Carter's motorcade. They've just come from Andrews Air Force Base, and they are arriving now at the US Navy Memorial. That is the caisson where President Carter's remains will be transferred from the hearse to the horse-drawn caisson, and that's where Ed O'Keefe is for us. Ed?
Nora, this scene, again, reserved for just our commanders-in-chief, and the kind of ceremony that we rarely see in this city, let alone in this country. The Carter family has been deeply involved in the planning for all of this, and there are elements that were presented to the late president that he didn't like. The idea, for example, of having his remains carried by train back to planes. This was one element that he was in favor of and that they asked to be added. And you mentioned the expectation that much of the Carter family will walk behind him. That's what we've been told, is that they will follow the casket on the streets up to the Capitol and in essence do this march in reverse. That famous walk to the White House on foot. This time they'll walk him up the hill to the Capitol, where he will lie in state tonight and into tomorrow for public viewing. It was 23,000 or so who saw him at the Carter Center in Atlanta. They're hoping for equally large crowds here in Washington in the coming days. But what we'll see unfold here is led primarily by the U.S. Navy and the Army. The various, there's midshipmen here waiting for him, and various Navy and Army bands, and then he'll be brought along Pennsylvania Avenue up to the Capitol. Nora?
Ed O'Keefe, thank you. I do want to talk more about his naval career. How much time was he deployed? Was he away from home? Was he away from Roseland?
Well, when he was on the submarine, they were obviously not with each other. But if you look at where their children are born, the three boys, they're all born at different bases, different places, one even in Hawaii. They were a typical couple living in a Navy life until that 1953 moment happened. So she had to be kind of dutiful in her own regard, as that generation of women were if their husband was in the military. We forget easily, guys, right? I mean, that people were still joining the military regularly. We were part of the Cold War effort. And this was not a light moment what Jimmy Carter's dealing with. I mean, the Soviet-China revolution occurred in 1949, and now China's communistic. And then you have the issue of the Soviet Union's getting atomic weapons, and the Cold War is on full throttle. and he's in Truman and early Eisenhower Navy, and there was a fear of a potential World War III, and a nuclear race was going on. And here's Jimmy Carter trailing along South China and Asia in submarines in that area. What could be more risky? But you had to be quiet, no shoes on, and when you're in a submarine, and you have to compartment yourself, not just the team, but he had to be, of one. And when people say that behavior in the White House occurred, that's where that comes from the military.
I know he went back home because of his father's death and to run the farm, but was there any indication early on that he was interested in politics?
His father was in politics. His father served in Atlanta as a representative. People underestimate that, and they also make it seem like he's just a peanut farmer. They were the biggest business going in Sumter County, Georgia. The peanut business was robust, but it was in decline. And he then joined, first political engagement was with the school board at the time of the 1954 Brown versus Topeka decision. And then when he runs in 1962, which he writes about in Turning Point, his memoir, they said he lost, and he said, no, I didn't lose. And they did the recount and he was right. They said he lost, and then they reinstated him because he challenged the so-called cemetery vote. It shows the hubris of Carter. Most people say you lose, and I thought about that with President Trump, with the thing. Carter actually went through the legal process and found that he was right, that he had been cheated of his first serious political job.
Nora, it does bring up one of those what-ifs in history.
Yeah.
Here he was going along a very successful career in the Navy, and I'm sure at that point he decided he wanted to be the chief of naval operations because he always wanted the top job. What if his father had not died and he had not been forced to resign his commission and go back to run the family business?
Right.
It's just interesting to contemplate.
I agree. I was thinking the exact same thing. This is a good moment to bring in Terry Adamson, longtime friend of Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, and served as their personal attorney for many years following their time in the White House. Mr. Adamson is also an inaugural trustee of the Carter Center. Terry, so good to see you. Thank you so much for being with us.
I've been enjoying this discussion. Thank you.
Have you been
listen to it. Yeah, some wise people there.
Any corrections you want to make or additions to our conversation, we welcome them, sir.
Commentary days, I would have made one other point that Doug almost made, but didn't quite. In the film of the original walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, one of the people in that picture is Jason Carter. He's on his dad's shoulders or his arms in the pictures you showed, and I do expect that he will be with the family that makes the next trip. So this is his second trip down Pennsylvania Avenue with his grandfather.
It's a wonderful point. And Terry, as you look at the former president's return here to Washington, what was his relationship while he was here in the nation's capital with many of the people here and lawmakers?
Well, Doug is a better commenter on that than I am. We've been getting a lot of stories today about him. He was a difficult relationship politically in Washington, and didn't go to Katharine Graham's house for invited dinners and cocktail parties in Georgetown. I think that's a little overstated. I'm not too impressed with that.
But Terry, it's Doug here. But if you could, that story with the ear
theory and why was it different?
You ended up President Carter.
I was going to get there. Well, that was when I first became his lawyer. We've known each other for 62 years, but it was really the last 43 that I would get to say that I became a really close friend. And it started when he hired me as an attorney for a particular matter, which involved a gossip columnist, Diana McClellan, who had moved from the Washington Star to the Washington Post. And our first column for the Washington Post reported a rumor that the Carters had bugged Blair House while Ronald Reagan was there to prepare for his transition to president, and overheard conversations between Nancy Reagan and Ted Graebner, I believe his name was, a decorator. And Carter was, when he heard this, it was published October the 5th, 1981, which is significant because that was the day Sadat was killed. And I actually was on the telephone with President Carter being hired as a lawyer when he got the message that Sadat was shot. And he didn't know that he was dead yet. And he interrupted my call, obviously, to go tend to that and then call me back later. But he wanted me to bring a libel suit against the Washington Post, and he demanded a retraction and an apology for this insult to him that he had done something so egregious against personal privacy as wiretap Blair House. And he was mainly concerned because he had returned to Georgia, he was broke, and the only thing he had was his reputation and his friends that he had made as president around the world. And he did not want people who were leaders of other countries to think that he had wiretapped them while they were his guests in Blair House. And so a big legal brouhaha ensued. I won't tell the whole story, Doug. If you feel like it, go ahead. But it ended up with 3 weeks later, after a lot of press and media about the Post, and Ben Bradley saying to Phil Gailey at the New York Times, which was published, that I will run naked down Pennsylvania Avenue before I apologize to President Carter.
Wow.
A few weeks later, Edward Bennett Williams, who was the Post lawyer, called me on the telephone in my office, which was around the corner from his. Mine was a tiny little office. His was obviously the most eminent firm in Washington. And he said, "Are you busy? Can I come to see you?" And we walked around, and he said, "This has gone long enough. What do we need to do to end it?" And I said the same thing President Carter said at the very beginning. But now you need to retract, you need to apologize, and you need to repudiate a policy which the Post has stated editorially that it defended the right to publish rumors about public figures that they knew to be false. And that really offended a lot of people. We had more media allies at that time than probably any time in Carter's political history. But it was, they did retract, they did apologize, and they repudiated the policy they could spread rumors about people they knew to be false.
So Carter got revenge on the Washington Post in the end, which he thought for a while was held captive by Ben Bradley and the Kennedy wing of the Democratic Party.
And I don't know if you can see, Terry, but we're now watching the beginning of this ceremony at the U.S. Navy Memorial. So let's just pause and listen for a moment as we honor the 39th President of the United States. And as we watch the U.S. Navy Memorial, you can see this formation of midshipmen from the U.S. Naval Academy, where Jimmy Carter graduated. He's the only president of the United States who graduated from the Naval Academy. You're looking at there, that is the Secretary of the Navy, along with the head of the U.S. Naval Academy. And so they are turning out their very best, the Navy is, to honor the submariner and former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. So much about his career. I'm sure many of these midshipmen and women want to learn about as they honor his legacy and pay tribute to him today and in the coming days.
I once asked President Carter if I could see his Navy record, and he said, "I don't have it." And I thought, well, of course you have it somewhere. And it was in St. Louis National Archives. And I got it, and it's just exemplary reports. I mean, he was a model midshipman. He was a model a veteran of the U.S. Navy. And at this moment, we have to think of him, which we don't often do, as Lieutenant Carter, because he was intense about the U.S. military and his love for our men and women of the armed forces. It was deep with him, as deep as his love of Christianity and the gospel.
This is the caisson in which the hearse will be moved to escort his remains to the US Capitol for that ceremony today. These ceremonial troops will present arms and render honors, the four ruffles and flourishes, and we will hear "Hail to the Chief" again. And then immediately following these honors, and we'll take them live as they happen and let you listen, the U.S. Navy band will play "Just As I Am" without one plea. And then it's then on the first note of the hymn that the body bearer team moves the caisson and places the casket on the caisson. And then family members will walk the procession route and move in position to go up Pennsylvania Avenue. There he is being escorted by this special honor guard. And in this funeral procession, the order of this march is the Military Honor Guard, the Advanced Motorcade, the National Color Guard, clergy, the caisson with the body bearer team, Presidential Color, and the motorcade. It's just an incredible thing to watch the tradition here of the way America pays tribute to our former presidents. And as we watch the hearse arriving at the U.S. Navy Memorial with former President Carter's remains, on the other side of the screen, you can see the Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, inside the rotunda, as a number of the dignitaries there are arriving inside the rotunda in advance of the ceremony to honor the former president and Lieutenant Carter, as Douglas Brinkley has noted we should be calling him now as we're at the U.S. Navy Memorial, to talk about his service to the Navy, how it influenced him, how it shaped him, his discipline, his service to our nation, and how did it influence his presidency, Douglas?
Well, he really believed that the key to being a commander-in-chief was peace. And there were many opportunities, a little like Dwight Eisenhower in this regard. Eisenhower, who signed all of the death certificates of World War II as Supreme Allied Commander in the 50s, said, peace, I'm not going to be writing about dead Americans. So Carter did anything he could, and really his proudest accomplishment of his presidency that was the United States didn't go to war, that he was able to keep America safe. But when in 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, it got his cackles up. And he started, he at that point became more of a Brzezinski hawk on the Soviet Union. But the mistake people make, because Reagan in 1980 wanted to raise the defense budget by 7%, Carter 5%. So he was a person who loved America's military establishment.
And here are some of the family members, Douglas, that have joined the procession there to walk alongside.
And, you know, he was an incredible father and kept them together as a unit. Every year, they would go on vacations to whether it's Disney World or Europe or Brazil or Alaska, and they're tight. They are Georgia people at heart. But we've been talking about Jason as the spokesman, but his father, Jack, served in the military, the Navy, and Jack was a Vietnam veteran. And so there's that connection into the family also. But only, you know, and one of his sons ran recently in Nevada for public office, didn't win. Jason Carter ran and didn't win. But the story, there's nothing to understand about Jimmy Carter about the love of life and family. They are a tight unit.
Carter is survived by 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren, many of them there today to join their loved one, some of them their grandpa.
And remember, President Carter's died at, you know, made it to 100. That's the marker for everybody. So they've been waiting for this moment. It was an incredible roller coaster year with hospice and reports about President Carter. But we saw his grit and determination. He wanted to outlive his wife so he could be her caretaker. He wanted Rosalind to be taken care of by him. And at a key summit, the children got together and said, we're going to have to do rotations in planes to keep an eye on the home there. Now, all the planes is really going to be the Carter, part of our National Park Service. Another side of President Carter we didn't talk about is his love of the men and women of our National Park Service. No president loved them more than Carter did.
Wow.
You know, I thought it was interesting when he declared he would go into hospice. And people just automatically assumed that he was going to die in the next day or so. So all the networks, including CBS, ran what would have been the obits that they had, and we all did that. You get an obit ready for famous people. They all ran them, and he was still alive, so he got to hear them. And I always thought that was a little extra for him. And,
but it's just he didn't want to make the trip to the hospital. He just wanted to be cared for at home.
Yeah,
right?
he had been shuttling for a while between planes in Atlanta always. Yeah. And then if you added up all his travels around the world, but the Emory University did a lot during Carter's life, both for the Carter Center and the Carter family's health.
Let's listen in. You know, the family said that this stop at the Navy Memorial is meant to take note of his service as a submariner and as a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and should also note that the site of this event, the Navy Memorial, was one of his lasting contributions as president, authorizing the construction of this Memorial Plaza and Visitor Center in 1980.
And another memorial of sorts to President Carter and his service in the United States Navy is the USS Jimmy Carter, a nuclear submarine that I believe was commissioned back about 20 years ago. And it's a testament to Carter's service as an officer on a submarine, serving, as Douglas Brinkley noted, throughout the world. And as much as Pennsylvania Avenue is associated with his presidency, to start here this walk up to the Capitol, this final march of the family, it's a salute to service, and in particular military service, which is so often tied in American history to the presidency. Not so much in the last 50 or 60 years, but Carter is part of an older school of presidents who saw that service in the U.S. military as a foundation for what would become political service later in life?
It's an excellent point, David.
And sometimes, we think of the military armed forces as being, going to war, but Carter saw it as a people's navy too, that young people can join and help make the world safe for democracy, and so he was very bullish on people doing that. It's you can volunteer through Christianity or missionary work, or join the armed forces, because often you're going in to help people in need around the world, not being in a battleground situation.
You're being, for a lot of people, and I was one of the first, you're part of something larger than yourself when you're in the military. I spent 3 years in the Air Force on active duty, and it was the first time that I had ever felt like I was doing something that was bigger than I was. I've always been ambitious and all of that, but to just be part of something like that, I think it was one of the things that unified this country. And I think it's one of the things we kind of miss now because we have the all-volunteer force.
Right, yeah. I grew up in the Army. My father, of course, was drafted and served 30 years, but most recently I've been reporting on 2 different aircraft carriers. The first journalist in the Red Sea with our 7 Navy sailors out there after the October 7th attacks. And I couldn't be more impressed by our U.S. Navy and the men and women who serve, sometimes 5,000 of them in tight quarters on an aircraft carrier, and those who really put their lives in harm's way. It's an incredible service, and so this tribute today, important, and also a reminder about what all the men and women who serve our Navy do. I have to ask you, Terry Adamson, who is still with us, who was a friend of the Carters for 60 years, what did Jimmy Carter say when he talked about his service?
Well, we did talk about it. Because we were both interested in Asia. And a lot of his time on the USS Pomfret was in Asia. And one of the what-if things that you were talking about earlier is he was swept off the deck of a submarine by a huge wave, and there was a moment in time that all of this history that we're talking about would never have happened. But he luckily, when the wave receded, he lost his grip on what he was holding, on the rail he was holding, but he landed on the front deck, and he grabbed the machine gun that's at the front of the deck, a 5-inch gun actually, and he was safe. But that's a little. He told me that story when we were in Shanghai one time, and it was really interesting. He also said he took a lot of pictures when he was in the Navy on that submarine. And I said, "Where are they?" He said, "A shoebox in the closet." I said, "Well, I'd like to see those." And they actually made one, and they redid the exhibitry at the Carter Center Museum. They actually included one of those that you can actually see through the periscope of the Pomfret from his service.
And one of the ironies here is here's this great Lieutenant Carter, Cold War naval hero, but when he ran for president in '76, it was all about no more Vietnam. So when he got inaugurated in 1977 and did this march down Pennsylvania Avenue, he also was giving amnesty to people who draft dodged or would not serve in Vietnam. That rankled a lot of the Navy, that Carter did that. Some of the people that were, and so there had been a period here where the Navy didn't fully put their arms around President Carter. That's changed, as Robert Costa said, when they named the USS Carter.
That brief shot was of the family, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter's 4 children there, and behind them, many of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have gathered for this procession and will accompany the horse-drawn caisson up Pennsylvania Avenue. And as we witness this moment, I want to note that during the Carter presidency, the United States was not involved in any military conflict. And the former president told Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes in 2010 that this was not just of circumstance, but also his belief in how America should assert its influence.
We went through 4 years We never fired a bullet. We never dropped a bomb. We never launched a missile.
Because of your religious views?
That's part of it, because I felt that our country should be, as a superpower, the champion of peace.
And some people will criticize that, have criticized that attitude, as saying that in Jimmy Carter's time we didn't look as strong. We didn't look like a superpower.
There's no doubt that usually a president's public image is enhanced by going to war. That never did appeal to me.
And yet on that note, too, about what Leslie brought up, did people view him as a strong president?
No, because our economy wasn't doing well. We had double-digit inflation, long gasoline lines. As we've just learned about 2024, the economy matters mightily, and President Carter didn't have a good hand with that, nor did Gerald Ford, who was trying to promote whip inflation now and wearing buttons. It was just that moment in America. But look at what Carter started doing. I mean, he created a Department of Energy, a Department of Education, started FEMA, was the first president to denounce apartheid in South Africa, and first president to go to Nigeria, and mainly he promoted human rights in our foreign policy, and that's how he won. But the Leslie Stahl clip is because he told the Soviet Union, the Kremlin, you're going to follow the Helsinki Accords. What are your human rights records? Why in Russia don't you allow Bibles? Why aren't synagogues open? And he embraced Jewish dissidents that came out of Russia and said, you're welcome here in America, or helped with Israel. So he frightened the Soviet Union because of his human rights approach, while he was also increasing military budget, but never brought us to war. If only the economy would have been better, and alas, the hostages, if they would have been released before the 1980, November 4th election, it may have been different, but Reagan had developed quite a bit of steam by the fall.
What about that, John Dickerson?
Well, Carter, just to pick up on that, the hostages, that in the foreign policy realm, presidents are bedeviled by the idea that they can just through the sheer sort of superhero power of the office can get things done. And Carter benefited from that and also was harmed by it. Let's look at two instances in the Middle East. On the one hand, the Camp David Accords, by all account, both Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, took place because of Carter's iron will, because he made them happen. And that is an act of personal diplomacy that's at the top of the rank. Then you look at what he tried to do in solving the hostage crisis, where he made a very, both for political reasons, but also because he believed it was a part of his relationship of transparency and honesty with the American public. He laid it all on the line that he was going to get those hostages out. And he worked diligently, but unsuccessfully. And while he initially had a strong public approval and support, after the hostages were taken, that withered. And so at the end of his presidency, not only was the economy in the doldrums, but of course, there was this global position of America in weakness. And think, this is America after winning the Second World War. Then there's Vietnam, Korea. It's the Cold War against the Soviets. So the stakes are very high. And so seeing the United States in a weakened position in the Middle East was, a part of a kind of national sense of weakness. But in terms of Carter's position in the presidency, the Carter Doctrine, which he authored, said that anybody who takes military action in the Gulf would be treated as if they were attacking the United States. This was a signal to the Soviets. So when he was creating peace between Israel and Egypt, it was not just about those two countries. It was about the major power conflict with the Soviets. And to lay out the Carter Doctrine is not a wimpy thing to do. It is a flex of American military power that is also a part of his legacy.
It's an interesting point about how the short lens of history versus the long lens of history judges a presidency. And, President Carter and the Iranian hostage crisis, that occurred because he allowed the exiled Shah of Iran into the United States to receive medical services. The militants then captured 52 American hostages. That lasted more than 440 days. But describe that, David, because until the very final hours of his presidency, Jimmy Carter is working the phone, working to bring those hostages home.
Well, Nora, he humanized the hostages. He learned everything about them, not just them as individuals that were held hostage, but who their spouse was, their mothers, their fathers. He took everybody's phone calls, and he was determined to bring them all back alive. That was the goal. He would later tell me, look, I could have bombed Tehran and say we're at war there and gone up in the polls. But he was serving, as he mentioned there, a religion in a way. He was putting his Christian values. And it's a strange and unusual moment where he's saying we're not going to lose people. And then he got the helicopter rescue mission. And he would later say, God, there should have been one more helicopter because a dust storm took it up.
This was in April of 1980, that rescue mission. 8 U.S. service members killed in that mission, 3 of those 8 helicopters failing.
And that cost a lot. And Cyrus Vance, his Secretary of State, stepped down, and Ed Muskie had to become, eventually there became a feeling that that rescue mission, look at with President Barack Obama with Operation Neptune Spear, we got Osama bin Laden. The operation worked. It helped his reelection, Obama, because of that. Where with Carter, that rescue mission failed, and it cost him a lot of political capital.
And many people think for Joe Biden, the deaths that occurred in the withdrawal from Afghanistan were devastating, not only to his record as a foreign policy statesman, but also hurt other candidates in that midterm elections.
You know, Nora, when the president said, he took great pride, no bullet was fired, no bomb was dropped, and all of that, I still think that the most significant achievement was the Camp David Accords, where he brought peace between Israel's strongest adversary, Egypt, and took them right off the battlefield. How many lives were saved as a result of that? Because you know what would have happened had that gone on. And I think it was probably the most significant, not economic, but development on foreign policy of my lifetime, quite frankly.
To this day.
Excluding World War II, because I was alive.
He called it the Holy Land, Israel, and he knew every nook and cranny of Israel. 2 maps he would keep of Israel and the Middle East and of Alaska for saving the public lands. And he was a bit of a micromanager engineer. I know that's the rap on him, but he knew everything from a biblical point of view in Israel and Egypt. He knew the whole backstory up into modern history. And I was always amazed as a governor, he took the time to go to Israel and meet Golda Meir, who he really wanted to see. And so he became a student of the Middle East, and his biggest frustration is that Palestine didn't get created.
He had a complicated legacy post-presidency on Middle Eastern affairs. Bob, you've covered so many presidents. What did they think about former President Carter continuing to wade into that issue and to, at times, criticize the Israeli government, weigh in on foreign policy? When it came to the Middle East, he was not some kind of quiet presence on foreign policy.
Well, they didn't always like it. They felt like he was meddling in their business, and sometimes they didn't say so in so many words, but they were sometimes uncomfortable with it. Having said that, I think history has shown that what he did was good. I mean,
and there's that photo we're looking at right there of the President's Club, and you can see a bit of distance between President Carter and President Clinton. Doug, did that reflect a tension, or was it just the photograph of the time?
There's some tension there. He wanted to be his own person. He was not close to President Bill Clinton, per se. Governor Clinton and Attorney General Clinton of Arkansas always disliked getting, putting boat lift people into Arkansas. There was no love lost there. And George Herbert Walker Bush, he became pretty close to. The friend of, it was James Baker, Secretary of State, and Carter would go hunting together, have prayer services together. They love each other. Secretary Baker's still with us to, watching hopefully right now. And Baker and Carter were tight. And it was Baker and Bush 41 that let Carter and work with him to monitor elections in Nicaragua, again, or Panama. But alas, Carter was opposed to the first Gulf War. And he put his gauntlet down on that. And that lost the trust of Bush 41 foreign policy team.
Well, we know James Baker is a big fan of CBS, so we hope he is watching. I want to bring in John Dickerson on this. John?
Well, just in a moment of frustration, John Whitehead, who was the Deputy Secretary of State under George Shultz in the Reagan administration, was once frustrated about Carter's post-presidency diplomacy, and he said we should take away his passport. So that was a moment where a Republican administration was unhappy with his continuing to be a diplomat. But, you know, thinking Bob mentioned that quote that Carter said about, you know, no shot fired. It's important, though, to remember the stakes of the Cold War that was still quite alive during Jimmy Carter's presidency. And I'm struck by a story that Zbigniew Brzezinski told, Carter's national security advisor. It was 1979. He's asleep in bed and he gets a phone call and he's told that 2,200 Russian missiles have been fired at the United States. And his wife is sleeping next to him, and he doesn't wake her because he figures there's no point. They'll hit before we can have, you know, a conversation. And he's about to call the president to tell him that this has happened, which would then initiate a retaliatory strike. And he gets a call and says, oh, hey, it was a computer tape that sent the wrong signal, and it's a false alarm. But it was not considered a false alarm when he got that call. And a presidency and in which that kind of situation can hit you at any moment is a little bit different. All the nuclear weapons are still in place, but that hair trigger relationship with the Soviet Union, which Carter counterbalanced also with normalizing relations with China, another part of his foreign policy legacy, that reminds us of the stakes that were at play, even though there was not a hot war during his presidency in which U.S. troops were involved.
It's an excellent point, John, too, that we've not mentioned about Jimmy Carter's opening relations with China as well. And as we watch this procession and reflect on the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter, we want to bring you something unique to CBS News. 10 years ago, we asked the former president to participate in our series, Note to Self, and listen to what he wrote to his younger self.
I'm writing to a 12-year-old Jimmy Carter, although I am now 90. As you now live and work on a farm in South Georgia and have just reached your highest goal of learning how to plow a field with 2 mules, I hope you will not limit the other ambitions of your life. I know your top ambition is to go to the U.S. Naval Academy and someday serve as a submarine officer. You must always do your best and use this experience to learn about the world we live in and how a strong nation can be a champion of peace. You will see how President Harry Truman's order as Commander-in-Chief to abolish all racial discrimination in the military service will bring welcome changes, but it always will need to be improved. When you return from the Navy, you must use your years as a farmer to expand your heart and mind as much as your father did, as preparation for the public service that is to come.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
In private life and in elective office,
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
You should remember the advice that you got from your school teacher, Miss Julia Coleman.
As my high school teacher, Miss Julia Coleman, used to say, we must
accommodate changing times
and still hold to unchanging principles.
The cheers and whistles rolled over Jimmy Carter for bringing the 2 old enemies together.
Let history record that deep and ancient antagonism can be settled without bloodshed.
In Oslo, Norway today, former President Jimmy Carter accepted the Nobel Peace Prize.
One of your greatest sources of happiness will be your wife, Rosalind, and the growing family that will be coming. Stay close to all of them. Bring them together whenever possible and provide them the same help and support that your own parents gave to you. You will get to know some great people. Some of them will be quite famous, and others will be known just to their own neighbors. Form as close a friendship with them as possible and learn from their example. You will face challenges and opportunities throughout your life, but don't worry. So many people will want to help you along the way.
It's a beautiful note to self as the idea and the concept, too, that we developed in CBS Mornings to write a note back to your younger self and the challenges that Jimmy Carter faced, and yet the extraordinary life that he lived of service and is being remembered for in these last couple of weeks. I want to bring in Secret Service Special Agent in Charge, Nick Steen. He oversaw Carter's Secret Service detail from 2017 until 2019. And Nick, it's so good to have you with us. And I have to ask you, what was it like protecting the former president?
When I took over President Carter's detail, he was already in his early 90s, so it was a very different form of protection. Obviously, everybody knows the role of the Secret Service as far as protecting from threats, but there's also when someone's elderly and has that age, there's that aspect of it, the medical component. So, but in addition to that, he was still very active. I mean, we still did foreign travel. He did a lot of fishing and hunting trips. He went on Habitat for Humanity builds. So he was a very active man in his early 90s. So that also added to that element of danger because, you know, being active, it wasn't that he was just sitting at home and we were protecting him in a chair, but we were wading through rivers and going on boats in the Gulf of Mexico. It was just, it was in many ways kind of surreal that he was able to do that and continued to do that well into his 90s.
What a wonderful experience. And I know you said that being with him was like walking through history. What do you mean?
It was, as a Secret Service agent, a lot of times when you're doing a protective mission, it's the now. I was on duty during September 11th and a lot of the other events before and after that where history's being made. You don't really reflect on it being history. It's just what's happening right then. But with him, a lot of our time together was him in reflection. We'd be driving around the farmlands around Plains, Georgia, and we'd have talks about him growing up and being a farmer and what farming is in the area. I learned a lot about farming from him. But I was essentially walking and living with history in every conversation I had with him. You know, he was still doing things. I remember there was still there were some issues with North Korea when President Trump took over as he was starting to start diplomatic relations, and President Carter wanted to go to North Korea to help facilitate that. And so, but in many ways, just every day with him was kind of like a history lesson, and he was very kind to always sit and talk and tell us about his experiences, primarily before he was president.
And Nick, not just protecting him and walking through history, you also went to Sunday school with him, didn't you?
Pretty much every Sunday, unless there was some reason we were out of town. He was, during my time there, he was teaching Sunday schools on Sunday there at Maranatha Baptist in Plains. So every Saturday night we would try to get him home, or he would be home to prepare his lesson for the next day, and then we would have to coordinate a very large gathering every Sunday. People would come from literally all over the world every Sunday to hear him give his Sunday school lesson.
We are watching the procession